morning, colleagues, distinguished scholars, and honored guests. It is a true pleasure to welcome you to this round table with what we used to call in Africa, 4 Baobab. This round table on Afro-diasporic thought across borders, situated within the broader intellectual framework of our conference, Borders, Belongings, and the African Diaspora. Yesterday, we were profoundly engaged by the keynote address delivered by Dr. Mbari Ngom, whose reflections on linguistic dissonance and aesthetic expression invited us to reconsider language as a site of resistance, reinvention, and epistemic transformation. That keynote did not conclude a conversation. It opened a horizon. And today's roundtable unfolds from that horizon. If yesterday we examined how African literatures in transcontinental languages disrupt hegemonic linguistic structures, today we extend that inquiry across borders, meaning geographical, disciplinary, and conceptual, to explore how Afro-diasporic thought circulates, transforms, and rearticulates itself across the Atlantic and beyond. To do full justice to the extraordinary careers of the 4 distinguished Baobab gathered here around this round table require far more than the 2.5 hours allotted to us. So please allow me to apologize in advance for the brevity of this introduction. We begin with Dr. Jerome Branch. Dr. Jerome Branch is Professor of Latin American Literature and Afro-Atlantic Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. A leading voice in transatlantic and trans-Hispanic studies, his work interrogates the race, coloniality, and diaspora. He has held prestigious international appointments, including Leverhulme Fellow at Birkbeck, University of London, and Fulbright Distinguished Fellow in Brazil. He has also served as Director of Publications of the well-known Revista Iberoamericana. His major works, Colonialism and Race in Luso-Hispanic Literature, The Poetics and the Politics of Diaspora, Transatlantic Musings, and Imperial Trajectories, Trans-Hispanic Reflections on the African Diaspora, have significantly shaped contemporary debates on Blackness and empire. His current research engages slavery, necropolitics, and coloniality from a trans-Hispanic perspective. We are honored to welcome Dario Hernão Restrepo. Dario, Professor and Director of the School of Literary Studies at the Universidad del Valle in Colombia, a foundational figure in Afro-Latin American literary studies. He has been instrumental in structuring doctoral research on Afro-descendants, histories, and cultures. His work explores the intersection of history and fiction, nation building, and the representation of Afro-descendant communities. His publications include O Faustico na Nova Narrativa Latinoamericana, Imágenes de América, La Unidad Diversa, Clio Revisitada, and El Código Chango, as well as his recent La Epopeya de los Hijos de Chango, a work that powerfully revisits African diaspora cosmologies through the legacy of Manuel Zapata Oliveira. We are equally privileged to have with us Dr. William Lewis, the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Professor in the Humanities at Vanderbilt University and editor of Afro-Hispanic Review. Widely recognized as a leading authority on Afro-Hispanic, Caribbean, and Latino U.S. literatures, he has authored edited or co-edited 14 books and more than 100 scholarly articles. His seminal works include Voices from Under, Black Narrative in Latin America and Caribbean Literary Bondage, Slavery in Cuban Narrative, Dance, Culture, and Customs of Cuban Looking In, Anthology of Latino Poetry, and the American Poet, Essays on the Works of Tato Laviera. His critical editions and introductions, particularly on Juan Francisco Manzano and Miguel Barnet, have been central to rethinking slavery, memory, and authorship. His current monographic study on Manzano further deepens our understanding of the origins of Cuban culture and Black literary expression. Finally, we return now in dialogue rather than keynote to Dr. Mbarengong, a distinguished scholar of Iberian, Latin American, and Francophone studies and dean at Morgan State University. His transnational and interdisciplinary work has been pivotal in institutionalizing Afro-Hispanic and African literary studies through foundational works such as Diálogos con Guinea, Palabra Abierta, and Antología de la Literatura Afro-Peruana, as well as his major editorial contributions to Equatorial Guinean literature. He is widely recognized as the scholar who introduced this corpus into North American academia. His extensive body of scholarships continues to shape global conversations on memory, identity, and postcoloniality. What brings these four baobab together around this table is not merely their distinction, but a shared intellectual commitment. Commitment to diaspora as a dynamic process, not a fixed condition. Commitment to literature as achieve and intervention. Commitment to transatlantic as a space of tensions, memory, and creative articulation. In their work, borders are never merely lines. They are sites of negotiation, rupture, and possibility. To open our discussion, I would like to invite each of you to share with us the central concerns of your current research and to reflect on how your work helps us reconceptualize Afro-diasporic thought as a dynamic force that not only traverses borders, but actively redefines them linguistically, culturally, and epistemologically. La pregunta inicial con la que vamos a empezar esta mesa redonda, me gustaría invitarles a cada uno a compartir con nosotros los ejes centrales de sus investigaciones actuales y a reflexionar sobre cómo sus trabajos nos permiten reconceptualizar el pensamiento afrodiaspórico como una fuerza dinámica que no solo atraviesa fronteras, sino que también las redefine en términos lingüísticos, culturales y epistemológicos. Vamos a empezar con Dr. Jerome Branch.
Estoy en dos proyectos. Primero, soy parte de un grupo que tiene como objetivo traducir al público anglófono americano a las obras canónicas de autores afrohispanos. Eso incluye el Brasil. Entonces me ha tocado pensar en una de las nuevas novelas brasileñas. El Brasil no ha recibido la atención que merece aquí en nuestro campo. Entonces voy a compartir con ustedes algunas de mis reflexiones acerca de este libro, un nuevo libro, Losas y Familia, de Elia Márquez, ¿sí? Willy es parte de ese grupo. Entonces, a eso, voy a hablar de eso. Pero aparte de eso también, yo soy de Guyana, una colonia ex inglesa. Somos el único país en América del Sur donde se habla inglés, pero no aparecemos en el campo. Bueno, por razones obvias. Entonces, después de tantos años estudiando Cuba, Colombia, Puerto Rico, etcétera, me he decidido dedicarme un poco a traer eso como un aporte, un poco de nuestra literatura guyanesa, ¿no? Entonces, para la próxima reunión de NEMLA, voy a hacer una ponencia sobre uno de nuestros autores, bueno, famosos, se llama Wilson Harris. Tiene una obra importante que se llama Palace of the Peacock, tiene puntos de contacto con la novela de la selva, porque después de todo somos de Sudamérica. Entonces, al hacer eso, bueno, ahí trae la novela, el mito de Macunaíma, El Dorado, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, eso es lo que vamos a presentar como nuestro aporte a la mitología y la literatura sudamericana, pero desde el punto de vista de un escritor anglohablante. Si quieren, puedo presentar lo que tenía sobre esta nueva novela. Last May 15th, the great house of the Nottoway Plantation of Louisiana, the largest remaining antebellum plantation in the American South, was mysteriously burned to the ground. The former sugar plantation, the most successful of its era, had been built in 1859 by the enslaved workers of the owner, John Randolph, and since the 1970s had been repurposed as a tourist attraction and marketed as Nottoway Resort. What was perhaps most noteworthy about this event, in terms of the mass media coverage and mass media responses, was the reaction of Black TikTok creators who celebrated the fire as an act of ancestral vengeance and retribution, or a symbolic, if partial, settling of scores with institutional slavery and the perpetrators as both a historical and a psychic phenomenon. These TikTok responses span the cultural registers of the Negro spirituals and performances of worship, and deployed other such Black musical genres as funk and soul as part of their soundtrack. Other responses to the fire took the form of academic analysis and denunciations, often expressing the dark humor and sarcasm common to Black vernacular comedy. As you saw, God don't need no matches. I choose to begin my presentation by reference to the Nottoway event to signal two things. Firstly, that the repurposing of slave plantations on the haciendas or fazendas in the former slave societies of the Americas has a clear objective of resuscitating the bygone colonial era of white material and symbolic power, while keeping its forms of dead capital alive. And secondly, that Black responses to such displays of power, even taking into account their brevity and limited real-world effect, remain as focused as ever on the idea of liberation. I say this also as a way of framing my reading of Elian Marquez's prize-winning debut novel, Losas de Familia, 2023, which focuses on the life experience of Black female domestic labor during and after slavery, and whose action is located in the southern Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul, famous in the 19th century for beef jerky production and their plantations, and home also to some of the recently refurbished fazendas in question. I propose that Losas, particularly given the geographical area of the novel's conception, lies at the intersection of the phenomenon of the performances of white colonial nostalgia in Brazil and of an emerging multidimensional Black counter-discourse. In her case, the counter-discursive has taken the form of a novel. Losas de Familia is framed around the central trope of the items of family dinnerware handed down from their original place in the dining room of the ostentatious dwelling of the white landowning family at the center of the story, to the home of Eluma, their lifetime maid. Eluma is also the recently deceased aunt of the narrator. The wares turn out to be emblematic also at many levels. First of all, in linking the two domiciles spatially, they at once create the historical chasm between colonial Brazil's plantation big house and its slave quarters, the iconic Casa Grande and the Senzala, both of which are transported now to a 20th century urban setting. In other words, the historical Casa Grande has been converted in the novel to a modern mid-century home. This is a mid-century style, with all the prestige that this architectural model implies. And this is placed in contradistinction to the poor and unpretentious flat of Iluma's multi-generational family. The mid-century's dinnerware, as icons of unpaid and underpaid labor across the decades between slavery and post-slavery periods, also serves to reaffirm the ongoing racial subjection embedded in slavery's institutionality, along with its deleterious effects on the Black Brazilian family, to which we will return below. In considering the relationality of the two homes, and by extension their inhabitants, it's important to stress that while the maid's unremitting domestic labor in keeping the crockery in the mid-century itself clean speak to the materiality of her place at the bottom of the social ladder, both the crockery and the mid-century as well independently also assume roles in her psychological subjection and that of her narrative intermediary, the niece. That is to say that even if we might assume that the wealth and social standing of the owners of the ostentatious mid-century to be self-evident, its white matriarch leaves no doubt as to the symbolic capital that her dinnerware commands, and she is unequivocal in affirming that the items pertain to the aristocratic hard-paste porcelain of the 18th century Qianlong period in China. Much like racial whiteness itself, both the house and the crockery will also stand as articles of desire for the maid Iluma and her niece. Marcus's novel, as indicated, assumes a counter-discursive position vis-à-vis a series of internet narratives of and about plantation guest houses and museums, which, like the Nottoway, represent and communicate the white colonial nostalgia signaled above. Over the past decade, internet reports from cities formerly associated with slavery in Latin America have depicted enactments of colonial-era domestic scenarios that juxtapose Black women in maids' uniforms with their employers or ostensible mistresses. These internet scenes, sourced from Cali, Colombia, and Rio de Janeiro and Salvador de Bahia in Brazil, even in their apparent disparateness, are part of a larger contemporary invocation of the colonial period, featuring properties restored and repurposed from ruin, which often include preparatory archaeological work and contain, when readied, a curated museum of relevant artifacts, along with appropriate academic and municipal or status endorsement that designates them as being of national heritage or even of a world heritage importance. Intrinsic to their day-to-day function as touristic visitation sites of historical memory and or as places of social relaxation for weekend getaways, or for the celebration of weddings, graduations, baptisms, and so on, is their role in the political economy of remembering and forgetting within the praxis of racial hegemony. In the final analysis, it's on the battlefield of remembering and erasure that Marcus's intervention, I propose, acquires its relevance as a political and aesthetic statement. There's an easily identifiable connection to begin between the staging and photographic documentation of an upper-class domestic gathering in the Lifestyles magazine Hola in December 2015, in which 4 generations of white women of wealth and social rank in Cali, Colombia, strike a leisurely seated pose while their uniformed black maids stand facing each other in the background. And the Guardian story in February 2019 on the birthday celebration of Donata Mireles, the fashion director of celebrity journal Vogue in Salvador Bahia. In the Guardian's picture, Mireles, also a white woman, is seated on a colonial style high chair, reminiscent of the cadera de Signa by the plantation mistresses of the colonial period. She's accompanied by 2 Black women dressed in white uniforms, which for some viewers were reminiscent of slavery days. Effectively, the valency of these women as plantation metaphors is underscored when we consider an additional internet report, one that was produced on this occasion not through an accidental or opportunistic staging, as the Hola or Vogue ones were, but as a more fully articulated presentation produced for and connected and directed towards a prepared and receptive audience, with different personae dramatizing the respective racial roles and acted out on a set, which happened to be a real restored late slavery era plantation. The story of the restored plantation came out in December of 2016. It focused on Elizabeth Dawson, owner by inheritance of the Santa Eufrasia plantation in Brazil's famous Vale do Café, whose fame is based on the prosperity that the region enjoyed in the 19th century and on the opulence of the landowning elite that marked the era, and whose memory has been the driving force between the process of restoration of Paraíba Valley plantations and their setting up as tourist destinations. The celebration of this memory is evident in the establishment of an insider group called Antigas Fazendas de Café e os Escravos, whose Facebook page declares, among other things, that the group is, quote, dedicated to all who love stories of haciendas, sugar mills, barons, slaves, and immigrants who lived in them, end quote. Here it bears noting that this restoration tourism trend, with its appeal to clear-cut social and racial roles, is not limited to the numerous coffee plantations in the Paraíba Valley or the Vale do Café. It's also in evidence in the sugar-producing plantations of the Bahia and Recôncavo and in the beef jerky-producing farms in Rio Grande do Sul, the location of Marquez's Louças de Família. Dawson's advertisement for her tours is, as reported in The Intercept, reads, "Tourists can be escrovatas for a day at the fazenda without racism." And visitors to the location were treated to a show in which Dawson outfitted herself in the colonial-style garb of the plantation mistress, and had black female employees. This was the previous slide. Outfitted herself in the colonial-style garb of the plantation mistresses, and had her black female employees wear slave-style uniforms of the era, as they prepared and served meals to the visitors or performed tasks around the property. In another part of the show, consisting of a guided tour of the plantation, they focus more on the end product of colonial labor, the articles of opulence as icons of prestige, and Dona Bechi, this is the name of the persona she assumed, would wander through the rooms of the casarão with her visitors in tow, animatedly pointing out stylish bed frames, armoires, wardrobes, recliners, writing desks, letter openers, nail files, and so on, noting their European origin where necessary and telling the individuals' family histories behind them or their place in the larger story of the property. The phenomenon of the tourist fazenda is repeated at the São João plantation at Pelotas. This is one of 30 such plantations associated with the Ciclo do Charque, Rio Grande do Sul's period of opulence from about 1780 to 1930. The area was of key importance in the production of beef jerky, as I suggested, which account for its long shelf life, could travel across county and feed, among others, Brazil's enslaved population. São João has been under the proprietorship of the current owners, the Massa family, since 1949, and like its neighbor, the Fazenda Santa Rita, has been reconstituted for visits along the lines of those in the Vale do Café. Before the tour of the buildings and the grounds, visitors watch a video that tells the story of the charqueada, stressing its role in the economy of the region, and of course that of the workers who made it the most successful beef jerky plantation of the era. For our purposes, among the various tools, instruments, and furniture of the period is the bust of an individual black woman, Cia Maria, made by Branca Massa, the daughter of Noris Massa, an early proprietress of the plantation. The bust was made in recognition of the work that she had done for different generations of the family, as maid and nanny and caretaker, even after abolition. The video narrative refers to her euphemistically as grande compañera of the family. Cia Maria's bust and her backstory as a transgenerational servant in the highly successful Charqueadas de São João provides us with an immediate and effective epistemic link to Marquez's novel, which also takes place in Brazil's southern frontier with Uruguay and covers over a century and a half of Rio Grande do Sul's socioeconomic history from the heyday of beef jerky in the 19th century through its decline with the introduction of the cold storage plants and the canned meat of the 20th century. It offers from below, as I suggested earlier, a counter-narrative to the triumphalist history or biography of the tourist fazendas previously mentioned. In presenting the painful details of the overexploited lives of the generations of black women attached to the local white landowning clan, the novel also reflects profoundly on the material and symbolic violence of racialized power in Brazilian slavery and post-slavery society, on patriarchy as its dominant institutional mode, and on the trauma that accumulates and is passed down historically and horizontally across generations, creating a dystopian existence whose horrifying psychic dimension the narrator would like to exercise through writing, even as the material aspect of slavery's legacy continued to be an existential challenge for her and for Black Brazilians. If Tia Maria, the lifetime maid of the big beef jerky Fazendo São João, is silent, with her life story reduced, as it were, to an inarticulate bust, and of whom all we know is that she was a grande compañera of the landowning family, Marquez has a different agenda in telling the story of Eluma, the narrator's aunt, and of the other women in her family condemned to a lifetime of domestic servitude. Hers is to vindicate their existence and in so doing expose the stark realities behind Black women's labor in colonial and post-colonial Brazil, a system that mercilessly exploited them even while claiming that they were loved like family. Black women's subjection in Brazilian and in the broader Latin American patriarchal system saw them involved in the multilateral domestic chores of cooking, washing, cleaning, and child rearing, while often catering as well to the sexual desires of the slave masters and their sons. The result was that their own families, when they managed to have one, were neglected. In the middle of the 20th century, several decades after the abolition of slavery in Brazil, 1888, when domestic work has officially been recognized in 1936 in terms of paid labor with a representative organization, the Association of Domestic Workers, Eluma was still largely retained in the parameters of the Mai Preta of the slavery era under the paradigm of fake white affection, while working tirelessly at every conceivable chore in the mid-century, as Marquez deliberately calls the modern-day Casa Grande. With her attention split between the two houses, her only biological son was neglected and made to feel as though he were the adopted one, while the children of the big house received all of her attention. Predictably, as Marquez's narrator notes, given the fake love of the white family, it is the wife and daughters of the patriarch who received the large benefits of his inheritance upon his death, while a moribund Eluma is neglected, and the niece has to resort to a GoFundMe among her church members for money to pay for her surgery, her medication, and her funeral expenses. As she mentions at one point, the white family for whom her aunt had worked for decades did not offer a single cent towards the purchase of her casket. The unhappy trajectory of Tia Eluma's life story as a living maid is paradigmatic of the hundreds of thousands of Afro-Brazilian women in the wake of slavery, and emblematic of the larger subjection of Black subjectivity in the racist regime of coloniality. It is significant that the narrator documents her aunt's descent into alcoholism, the personal shame of incontinence that results from her excessive consumption of beer. She would just pee herself randomly, and her eventual conversion to Protestantism that all of this implies in terms of an aspiration to cultural whiteness and social acceptability. Her own skepticism, however, is unmistakable. Kuandu, the niece, notes that the most noteworthy evidence of her Aunt Eluma's incorporation into the community of the now prevalent Protestant church in Brazil was that she was not busily occupied in cleaning up the church as well. And she goes on to suggest that when she gets to heaven in the afterlife, she would certainly be put in charge of the dinnerware and of other domestic chores there in heaven. Conversion to Christianity, in other words, and the aunt's abandonment of her ancestral orishas identity as a preta batuqueira is to become a mulher branca da igreja, a white woman of the church. That does not change the contours of her existential dilemma under coloniality. Indeed, Eluma's alcoholism and premier demise, while being a mulher de Cristo, a woman of Christ, seem to point to a failure of syncretism as a rhetorical pivot in the larger discourse of mestizaje in Latin America. The niece Kuandu, who was born into a later generation with opportunities for formal education that allow her to aspire to be a creative writer, turns out to be no less vulnerable to the racial determinism of coloniality. Her own trajectory is marked by a status definition of her Black gendered subjectivity that, notwithstanding the escape hatch of schooling for upward mobility, offers her no protection from a murderous derogation, paraphrasing W.E.B. Du Bois, of Black skin, hair, and bone, both in the public and in the private spheres, and the merciless sexual abuse expressed verbally and quite possibly physically also, again, both in the private and in the public spheres. From her father's reference to her as a negra de merda, or a negra loca, her schoolmates' racialized mockery, and the traumatic experience as a teenager to being the object of loud public sexual speculation by a group of soldiers, she emerges convinced that o nosso corpo preto é uma prisão sem portas. Our black body is a prison without doors. Significantly, she traces her sexual and gendered being all the way back to her birth certificate as the moment in which Brazilian state documented her officially as a member of the national community under the colonial parameters of race and gender. It is a bureaucratic procedure that canonizes whiteness and masculinity and distributes privilege along the color spectrum from white to black. Here we note that the Brazilian racial taxonomy, even now in the 21st century, still has a recognition in the vernacular of at least 60 categories of skin color and the direct and indirect social value attributed thereto. That being said, it is certainly her father's subjection to the alienating colonial and post-colonial racial order as it manifests in a particular version of black masculinity that would explain why the narrator, channeling Fanon, refers to his behavior, her father's behavior, as if he were a white man. That's in the domestic space that they share as members of the same family. Her reference to her father as her former father, after the incident in which he hurls hot rice at her face in a fit of rejection, quite possibly refers to her subsequent murder of him. If the narrator's parricide represents an instance of violence and rage against the system, it is to be noted that as a specifically gendered response, the overarching machinery that produced and supported a toxic black male masculinity is no less deserving from the narrator's standpoint of some sort of apocalyptic destruction. Her rebellion here, as it turns out, is sublimated. As in the narrator's dream of uprising, she's converted into a sort of winged avenger, one that combines the powers of the mythical Ghanaian anti-colonial female hero, Ya Asantewa, and the contemporary guerrilla protagonist from neighboring Uruguay, the Tupamaros, in an effort to destroy the losas of the big house and, by extension, the rest of contemporary Brazilian society in its present form. Her invocation of another female warrior hero, the Jamaican anti-slavery rebel and Maroon leader, Nani, at another similar moment of resistance, instantiates her articulation of a transatlantic outer national imaginary Malunga community on account of its black solidarian ethics and its rebellious orientation. We recall that the concept of Malungaje derives originally from the experience of joyous reunion and mutual recognition displayed among former slave captives or shipmates or Malungos after the shared trauma of their Atlantic crossing, as witnessed by British travel writer Robert Walsh in 1828. It projects a teleology of liberation based on their solidarity and survivalism. Inherent to this episteme is also a discursive poetics for Afrodescendants that contains both a diachronic and a synchronic dimension to account for the 500 years of slavery and post-slavery, while also articulating a poetics of freedom. Marcus's Luosas y Familia, for interpolating contemporary black writing and experience in the novel, speaks to this synchronic temporality of Malungaje and to its outernational spatiality, and her conscious exploration of a transgenerational family history with its stated objective of denunciation conforms its diachrony. Accordingly, we see her narrator invoke a range of diasporan black writers whose work speaks to the larger transatlantic experience of black life, calling forth insights born both within the crucible of coloniality and traditional Pan-African culture. Her writers include such iconic figures as Aimé Césaire, Martinique, Toni Morrison, the U.S., Wole Soyinka of Nigeria, Amos Tutuola of Ghana, Derek Walcott, St. Lucia, Jamaica Kincaid, Antigua, Amadou Kourima, Ivory Coast, and Georgina Herrera, Cuba. The multilingual work and the dispersed geographic provenance of these writers at Marcus Marshall's to enhance the gravitas of her own Malunga intervention is a poignant reminder of the linguistic diversity of the original captive Africans and the colonized Africans today, and pointedly of the linguistic and pointedly of the linguist side, the death of language produced by enslavement and exile, and the colonial languages that have become the currency for communicating among us today. Referencing them signals that her story is not only Brazilian, but diasporan, and her investment in a revolutionary iconography, one that is transatlantic, suggests that even while Losas de Familia is often submerged in sadness, as per the Afro-pessimists, or involved in the wistful backward glance of a Brazilian, Afro-Brazilian ancestralism, there is fire beneath the smoke. Her Malungaje reminds us that even if rebellion is not imminent, it is latent. Rebellion is imminent. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias por estar aquí en esta mañana y a la Universidad de Missouri, a nuestro común amigo Mamadou Adian, a Joseph Ottavela y a los profes y estudiantes de esta universidad. Es para mí un honor estar conversando hoy con ustedes, que sé que son expertos y estudiosos de estas temáticas que nos convocan hoy. Voy a organizar mi participación en varios puntos. El primero es respondiendo a la pregunta de mi experiencia investigativa. Pues empiezo por un dato biográfico mínimo que es importante. Mi padre fue un ferroviario en la ciudad de Buenaventura, que es el mayor puerto de Colombia en el Pacífico. Por ahí pasa el 50% de las exportaciones de Colombia, y la mayor parte de la población es negra. Cuando yo era niña, mi papá me llevaba, su primera mujer era una negra de Buenaventura, y tenía 3 hermanos muchísimo mayores que yo, de 24, de 18 y 20 años, yo tenía 7. Esto lo cuento es para contestar una pregunta que me hacían mucho en las comunidades del Pacífico, no siendo yo tan afro, sino mezcladito. ¿Por qué ese interés? Desde niño me marcó mucho la cultura afro de mi país. La música, la comida, las maneras de ser, el ritmo. Y empecé a entender a medida que estudiaba esa historia. Y eso me ha llevado a entender ese mundo en el cual pasé parte de mi infancia. Y luego en el barrio donde yo viví, porque soy de una ciudad donde la mayoría de la población es negra. Yo jugaba fútbol y yo era el capitán, pero la mayoría de los jóvenes que jugaban fútbol eran afros, que es una de las formas de ascenso social, como en muchas partes del mundo, jugar fútbol y llegar a ser. Y prácticamente los grandes jugadores de fútbol colombianos son de origen afro. La mayoría, si no la totalidad, por lo menos la mayoría. Eso es una explicación pues sencilla que explica por qué yo estoy tan metido en esto que siempre me tocó. No hago en la vida sino lo que me gusta. Lo que no me gusta, sobre todo en el terreno intelectual, no lo hago. Estudié en Brasil y allá empecé en serio mis estudios, dijéramos, afros, por razones obvias. Por supuesto, iba al samba todas las semanas, a las escuelas, carnaval, y conocí poetas, narradores, cantantes del mundo afro, y fui mucho a las favelas, en un programa que había en mi universidad, de la Universidad Sin Muros. Y esto me parece muy importante destacarlo, porque desde ahí, y de lo que aprendí en Colombia, yo siempre lo que hago en el alto nivel, que es en el doctorado, en las maestrías, estoy preocupado en pensar cómo lo hago llegar más abajo, a los otros niveles de la educación, a otros sectores. Porque en mi época universitaria trabajé durante 3 años enseñándole a leer a los corteros de caña de mi región, que ellos sí eran totalmente negros, del Pacífico colombiano, los cortadores de caña en los ingenios azucareros de mi región, que es la región mayor productora de caña del país. Y después trabajé en el río Magdalena en educación, y ahí también me volví a encontrar con el país afro, o con el país mulato, el país sambo o mestizo. Y allá fue donde tuve la fortuna de conocer a Manuel Zapato Olivella cuando yo era un joven de 23 años. Y puedo decirlo hoy, ya tengo 70, que esa relación con Manuel cambió completamente mi visión del mundo, mi concepción de mi país. Y por eso entonces empecé a trabajar en mi tesis y en mis desarrollos investigativos que me llevaron a cuando regreso del Brasil después de casi 14 años, trabajando allá en la Universidad del Estado de Río de Janeiro, que también vuelvo, insisto, esto es biográfico, la Universidad del Estado de Río de Janeiro es la Universidad Negra de Río de Janeiro. Allá el 80% está en la zona norte, está al lado de una de las grandes escuelas de samba de la ciudad. Por tanto, eso me puso en contacto siempre con el mundo negro. Nunca me ha extrañado ir, por eso me gustaba ir tanto a Cuba, por eso me gustaba ir a Puerto Rico, a Dominicana, y conocí pues todo el litoral brasileño, sobre todo una ciudad donde investigué varias veces, que es Salvador de Bahía, a donde hice mi tesis doctoral, siguiéndole la pista a las fuentes de la religiosidad de matriz africana que hay en Zapato Olivella, y que yo sabía que Manuel, porque me lo contó, y estuvimos juntos una vez en Brasil, él recorrió toda esa zona de Bahía, de Minas Gerais, de Ouro Preto, y por eso se refleja en su novela. De manera que esa también fue una forma de preocuparme por esos intereses. Ya con esto puedo decirles que hace 20 años construí en la Universidad del Valle el Centro Virtual Isaacs, que es un centro para recuperar la memoria cultural y literaria de la zona de mayor población afro que tiene Colombia, que es el Pacífico colombiano. Son 3, 4 estados, junto con el Caribe, ahí está el 80% de la población afrocolombiana. Y una de las cosas que entendí cuando llegué del Brasil era que muy poco se había rescatado de esa memoria. Y empezamos a reconstruirla en esta página, en esta web, donde está pues lo que hemos hecho durante todos estos 20 años, en donde hemos hecho la recuperación de obras como la de Jorge Isaac, gran autor del siglo XIX, que escribió la novela más leída en español en el siglo XIX, María, que es la novela que Manuel Zapata consideraba la primera gran novela negra de Colombia, porque ahí, siendo Isaac de origen judío, hace un homenaje a la diáspora africana, en el personaje de Nay, que muestra todas las historias de que sale de Gambia. Empezamos a estudiar ese autor, muy poco trabajado y muy relegado porque su posición como liberal radical lo aisló al perder los radicales en Colombia en el finales del siglo XIX con los conservadores, y eso llevó a que tuviéramos un desconocimiento de mucha de nuestra tradición progresista y democrática en el siglo XIX. Colombia fue un país de guerras civiles como nadie. Ustedes lo habrán leído muy bien en Cien años de soledad. Lo que García Márquez hace en Cien años de soledad es metaforizar las guerras civiles del siglo XIX y la inutilidad de muchas de esas guerras y todo lo que ellas significaron para el país. Bueno, lo que hice con mis sax, después lo volvimos una web, hicimos unos simposios, vamos para el 16. El antepenúltimo lo hicimos en Dakar, después de haber recuperado toda la obra de Zapata, que fue segundo gran emprendimiento que hicimos en el centro virtualizado. Colocar toda la obra de Manuel Zapata Olivella, la edición completa de Letras Nacionales, que poco se conoce, que creo que quien quiera conocer a fondo la literatura colombiana y la cultura colombiana, sobre todo de la segunda mitad del siglo XX, tiene que ir a Letras Nacionales. Es la revista más importante, fundada por Manuel en 1965. Este trabajo nos ha llevado a investigar pues, todos estos aspectos y logramos entonces crear un grupo de investigación, se llama Narrativa Colombiana y Latinoamericana. Ahora le llamamos narrativas porque incluimos la música, incluimos el cine, incluimos otros lenguajes, y entonces hemos estudiado, por ejemplo, seriamente el tema de la influencia de la música africana en la música del Pacífico. Es obvio que todas las músicas, pero es ya en concreto hecho por musicólogos, por expertos que hacen, como por ejemplo la influencia de la religiosidad, en el caso nuestro, en la religiosidad del Pacífico, ¿no? También se han hecho unos trabajos muy interesantes en eso, en la gastronomía. Ya hemos venido recuperando esa memoria cultural y construyendo, dijéramos, ya de manera rigurosa, mediante los estudios de investigadores de nuestros doctorados y de profesores que lo han hecho, esta memoria cultural. Ese ha sido como el trabajo en el que yo he estado. Producto de eso, fundamos un doctorado en estudios afro-latinoamericanos, creo que es el único que hay en Colombia. Ya tenemos 5 cohortes y hemos más o menos logrado sacar 20 tesis adelante, defendidas. O sea, con eso hemos ido creando en el país, poco a poco, una tradición que no existía, que es relativamente nueva. Cuando hablo nueva es de 2, 3 décadas antes, quizás es el Valle del Cauca, algo de lo que se hace en Cartagena y en la Universidad Nacional de Colombia y la del Cauca. Son como las universidades donde estas investigaciones son importantes, han ido ganando un espacio. Con esto lo señalo es que este trabajo es reciente y es una lucha por establecer los estudios afro y el rescate de esa memoria en la academia. Y por tanto, de ahí para que baje a los estudios secundarios. Por eso es tan importante la, el, el centro virtualizado como plataforma, porque eso fue lo que aprendí en el Brasil. Lo que se hace arriba, a los niveles en los que estamos todos nosotros, hay que bajarlo, hay que llevarlo. Esa es, creo yo, la mayor responsabilidad, dijéramos, que tenemos nosotros. Porque no solo nos interesa lo que hacemos a este nivel, sino que eso pueda irse traduciendo. En el caso nuestro, y sé que en muchos países donde he ido es así, los brasileños nos dan mucho ejemplo. Allá me formé y mantengo una relación concreta, por eso saludo mucho el trabajo que están haciendo los colegas de la Universidad de Pittsburgh con Jerón a la cabeza, de introducir más lo que se hace en Brasil, por obvias razones. Es decir, esos son, en el caso de América Latina, pues son el país que más relaciones tiene con África, más son la mayor población de hijos de África fuera del continente, de afrodescendientes, son los brasileños. Y los desarrollos y el proceso en el que están actualmente es extraordinario. Es decir, creo que es una corriente clave y fundamental de la cual podemos aprender, como aprendemos de la caribeña y como aprendemos, por supuesto, de los estudios afroamericanos que han sido tan importantes para nosotros. Quiero decirles aquí con todas las letras, si no hubiese sido por los estudiosos afroamericanos en los años 70 y 80, Manuel Zapata Olivella no hubiese obtenido por lo menos un reconocimiento mínimo en Colombia. Fueron los afroamericanos. Aquí está William Luis, que los conoció muy joven, estuvo con Manuel en Sao Paulo, en el segundo Congreso de las Culturas Negras de las Américas, y que el primero lo hizo Manuel mm, en Cali en el 77, después de haber estado en el Congreso de Dakar en el 74, en Negredumbre de América Latina, que patrocinó el presidente Leopold Sédar Senghor. De eso existen memorias, y por eso volvimos en el 74, en el 2024, 50 años después, con el lema Manuel Zapato Olivella vuelve a África. ¿Qué llevamos a África? Pues toda la obra digital. Ya la consultan en todo, se están haciendo tesis en los países que llegaron al Congreso, y eso nos da una felicidad, porque quiere decir que todo eso, este trabajo está dando frutos, es la semilla, comienza a funcionar. Bueno, lo otro que quería señalarles es que nosotros hemos empezado desde el 2010 a rescatar las obras afrocolombianas. Hice parte de la biblioteca afrocolombiana, 19 volúmenes, y también se hizo la biblioteca de las literaturas indígenas. Esto pues hace 15 años es muy reciente, ¿no? Es un país que tiene una tradición. Colombia es el segundo país con más lenguas indígenas vivas después de México. Tenemos uno de los atlas lingüísticos indígenas más completos, que es un modelo mundial. Sin embargo, cuando ustedes van allá, el- el desconocimiento y la poca expresión que tienen los movimientos indígenas es todavía muy precaria. Lo mismo con la literatura afrocolombiana. Ya hay autores, hay novelistas, hay poetas, hay movimiento musical. Tenemos un fenómeno como el Petronio Álvarez hace 32 años, que es un festival extraordinario, en donde todo esto que estaba recóndito, como lo llamaba un teórico, un escritor del Pacífico llamado Sofonía Yacuta, escribió un libro en 1934 donde hablaba de ese Pacífico como el litoral recóndito, poco conocido. Eso está aflorando. Quizás el Caribe lo hizo unas décadas antes, y en eso la labor de Manuel y de Delia Zapata fue muy importante, porque Manuel con su hermana fundaron el Instituto Folclórico Nacional en el 46 y recorrieron el mundo con las danzas folclóricas de Colombia, y llevaban las danzas de las poblaciones más apartadas del país, las llevaban a la capital y empezaron a promover el conocimiento de esas tradiciones. Yo me acuerdo que Manuel siempre me decía, mira, lo más importante de Colombia están las culturas populares, están en esos pueblos analfabetas y semianalfabetas. Esos son los que ha construido la nación. Y ese es quizás uno de los temas que más hemos venido trabajando ya en el doctorado, que es las investigaciones que apuntan a mostrar cómo ha sido el proceso de la construcción de la nación de manera incluyente, o sea, cuál ha sido el papel de los pueblos indígenas, de los pueblos afros, de los pueblos eh, que nosotros ya tenemos estudios afroindígenas, porque ya hay zonas donde ha habido una relación muy fuerte y una entre indígenas y afros, eh, lo que obliga a que tengamos también que estudiar eso, no como solamente los afros y por acá los indígenas, no. Ahí ya hay culturas afroindígenas en el país. Por tanto, ese ha sido como los objetos de nuestros estudios. Yo he trabajado muchísimo, sobre todo en la parte cultural, en la novelística, en las poéticas, cómo se han venido construyendo. Y hemos, pues, trabajado alrededor de todos estos autores. También le tenemos página a más de 60 autores del Pacífico, además de la de Manuel. Y ahorita estamos en un proyecto muy grande, que es el que paso a contar rápidamente para terminar. Colombia necesita una historia de su propia literatura, una historia crítica, pero ya no la historia crítica hecha desde la capital, hecha desde los centros, sino una historia que se haga desde todas las voces de la nación, que incluya de verdad la nación. Ese es el gran reto de esta historia crítica en la que estamos trabajando hace más o menos unos 10 años. Y el proyecto ya lo formalizamos hace unos 3 o 4, con 2 simposios dedicados exclusivamente. A final de este año vamos a hacer otro, y que consistirá en hacer, pues, una historia crítica desde la colonia hasta nuestros días, digamos que sea incluyente, una historia crítica de todas las voces, porque hasta ahora lo que existe es que para reivindicar a los afros, entonces hacemos una historia de los afros aparte. Para reivindicar a las mujeres, historia de la literatura de las mujeres. Entonces se han abierto, y ahora entonces la LGTBI. No, yo creo que lo que aprendí con mi maestro Noé Trige en el proyecto que ellos hicieron en los años 80, en la historia crítica de la literatura argentina, es algo en donde esté todo en diálogo, en donde se vean esos procesos en diálogo, en contradicción, en debate, pero que hagan parte de un mismo conjunto. Y eso es lo que estamos tratando de hacer. Para eso construimos un doctorado en historiografía de la literatura colombiana. Ya llevamos 2 cortes, estamos dirigiendo buenas investigaciones. He creado una red de 120 investigadores de la literatura colombiana, necesitamos 300. Estamos detrás de la platica porque necesita una plata grande para hacer esto, porque es por contratación directa a los investigadores en los 15 volúmenes que están establecidos. Pero lo que quiero señalar para lo que aquí nos interesa es, estamos pensando es cómo se integra las voces afro, las voces indígenas, las voces populares en todo esto. Porque ¿qué es lo que ha pasado hasta ahora? Es el predominio de la literatura culta, de la alta literatura, ¿no? Que es importante. Por supuesto, García Márquez es importante, Cepeda Zamudio, los poetas del siglo XIX, todos. Pero ahora hay que pensarlos cómo dialogaban con otras voces que existían en todas estas épocas. Aún en la colonia podemos encontrar por ahí algunas voces, en el periodo republicano y en el siglo XX ni se diga. Y cierro diciéndole que Colombia está hoy en uno de los procesos más importantes después de 200 años de historia republicana, y es la de que por fin las élites tradicionales les tocó cederle el gobierno y el espacio a nuevas fuerzas sociales que han empoderado a los movimientos populares, a los indígenas, a los movimientos afros, a los movimientos campesinos, a los movimientos artísticos de todo tipo. O sea, ya eso se generó y ya el país es otro, independientemente de la valoración que tengamos del gobierno actual, que yo la considero muy positiva. No quiere decir que no haya errores, pero sí es positiva. Pero lo que yo señalo con esto es que se han instalado una serie de cambios profundos en el país que ya no tienen regreso. Eso es lo importante, eso no va a tener, eso va a seguir, y a eso es a lo que tenemos que sintonizarnos los investigadores, los académicos, de poder contribuir a esto. Yo le hacía una pregunta en ese sentido a las investigadoras que escuché ayer, es decir, de qué manera todo lo que nosotros hacemos también sirve como luz, como orientación a todo este fenómeno, porque no podemos estar de espaldas a eso, realmente nos toca en nuestro papel, y eso es realmente lo que nos ha movido siempre a esto. Y finalizo diciéndole que como yo conocí a Manuel joven, tenía 23 años y él tenía, en ese momento, creo que iba a cumplir 48. Entonces, buena parte de lo que hago ha sido con este título, que fue el que yo le di al simposio de Dakar, que es tras las huellas de Manuel. Él, en el fondo, lo que hemos seguido es las huellas de Manuel Zapato Olivella, de su obra. Es una de las obras quizás más completas de intelectual alguno en la historia de Colombia y creo que uno de los grandes de la historia de América Latina, de gran proyección internacional mundial. Es un patrimonio. Y haberlo llevado a África de nuevo, pues fue una felicidad. Por tanto, pues a eso es a lo que yo me dedico. Espero que en los últimos años podamos concretar esto que les he contado, de poder hacer esta historia crítica de la literatura colombiana, en donde puedan estar todas las voces que han construido el país. Muchas gracias.
What I pretend to do today is something totally different than what I normally do. Normally, as scholars, we are called to put together scholarly papers and we present them in the readings, as you have attended the conference here and seen elsewhere. Well, what I like to do is do something a little bit more personal, do engage more in the autobiographical act, to talk a little bit about myself, but also to try to bring to light what you will see in our CVs, in our curriculum vitae, where we have listed what we've done. But what I want to do is do a reading of some of these things that we've done, or look in between the lines to show the relationship between what we do as people who are engaged in ordinary lives and how that is transferred to our academic work. And so, for me, a key moment in my life was when I went to college at Binghamton University. There were about maybe 15 of us who were not white, entering into a white campus. And we felt like, coming from New York City, we felt very strange in this type of environment that really didn't reflect not only people who look like us, but people who lived like us and who enjoyed other things other than that we grew up with in New York City. And so this was a very foreign environment. And those of us who were at Binghamton came together and we created an organization called, and these were African American students and Latino students. And we came together because of a common cause, and we called ourselves the Afro-Latin Alliance, ALA. And this was probably the first organization of its kind in the country, where Latinos and African Americans came together to assert our own identity and create our own identity in this space that we called a completely white university. And as a result of that, we were engaged in activism, trying to get more students of color at the university, trying to get professors, creating Latin American Studies program, and so on and so forth. And so that was kind of my initiation into topics that that needed to be attended to, but weren't really being attended to in this particular case. Our presence there, but then also in the kind of studies that we wanted to expose the university to, and that had to do with works and ideas that had to do with our own presence in order to enrich the environment. And so that was kind of a very key moment. And again, as I engages in this autobiographical act, the autobiography for me is a relationship between how in the present we look at the past. That is, that the past does not exist without an understanding of the present of where we are. So in this particular act, I am here in the present. I'm looking back and then I'm seeing how that past has helped me also to understand where I am. So this dynamic relationship between the present and the past is an important for me, an important element of the autobiographical act. I never thought about entering academia. It was the farthest thing from my life. I wanted to be a counselor, a college counselor, because I liked the college environment. It took me away from growing up in the Lower East Side, which was plagued with a lot of drugs, heroin, gang violence, and so on and so forth. So the university was kind of it seemed like a nice place that I wanted to spend more time at. But it didn't work out that way. And so I wound up teaching elementary school, third grade, and then another time junior high school. So I have this public teaching experience that I don't know if it's helped me or not, but it did help me in the sense that I realized that that's not what I wanted to do. And I wanted to get back to a university environment. And so I did a master's at the University of Wisconsin, and this notation that I'm expressing to you was profound in how I decided to go back to graduate school, and it's something um, that I also explain in my Guggenheim application. As many of you know, I was a recipient of the Guggenheim in 2012, and part of the Guggenheim project is for you to write an autobiographical essay. And I wrote about this experience in Wisconsin of meeting a young lady who was very bright, and her parents were both university professors. And so when the master's program ended, we continued my master's program. She was an undergraduate. Um, I started hanging out with her at her home in Long Island, and I felt like really stimulated because there were lots of books and conversations. I should say that my mother was a single parent in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and raised two boys in a very dangerous environment. And I think that we were quite lucky not to have been scarred as many of the people in the neighborhood had been. But our life there was kind of very simple in the sense that my mother worked, we went to school, and so on and so forth. Watched TV, had some friends, but in this other environment, I was stimulated by the academic conversations, the knowledge, the books, um, all of the interactions, and it was something that became very attractive to me, and so. For that reason, with this person that I was dating, she was going to Princeton to do graduate work in linguistics, and I decided maybe I should go back to school just to keep up with her. Maybe the family will accept me, so on and so forth. And so I decided to go back to school, and I wound up applying and being at the best school for me at that time, which was Cornell University, that had Diacritics, which was a very important critical um, and scholarly publication. And there I met Roberto González Echevarria, who became my mentor, and played a very important role because when my relationship with Irene ended, I did not, and that's another story, but if there are questions afterwards, I'll be happy to to tell you what happened. But I was already at Cornell, and I knew that I was not there necessarily for me, but just to gain some kind of acceptance. And so we broke up, and I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to stay at Cornell. And so I spoke to my dissertation director, and I said to him, I wasn't doing this for me. I don't know if I want to be here. I just want to go back to New York. And he looked at me and he let me talk, and then he gave me the best advice. And this is recorded in my Guggenheim application. He said to me, "Déjate de comer mierda y ponte a trabajar." Yeah. Stop eating shit and get to work. And and from that moment, I realized that I was doing the PhD for me. And what I did is I began to read and become interested in as many topics as I could, because there were so many areas of growth for me, and that continues to be the case till today. I get involved in many different projects because there's always a learning process in these projects. So anyway, so at Cornell, of course, I studied Derrida, Foucault, Barthes, and all those, Jacobson, and all those critics. But then I realized that as I began to write my dissertation on a Cuban writer, Cesar Leante, a Cuban writer who emerged with the Cuban Revolution, I began to see that the literary criticism wasn't really that helpful to me. And I began to consider reading more about history. And history became essential for me because not only it gave me a background uh, to situate the works that I was analyzing, but also it allowed me to view the interaction between literature and history. In some cases in our profession, we tend to talk about works, and we continue to connect one work with another, which is a very valid approach to literature. But in my type of work, I like to associate the work with the historical moment, and not only the historical moment of that takes place in the work, but also the historical moment that has to do with the time of writing, because there is a relationship, in my belief, that you look at the time of writing of the piece, and then look at the time of writing that the narrative is situated in, and it's a good, interesting relationship between the two. And so, for me, literature is a count as, and I say this in my book, Literary Bondage. Literature is a counter discourse to history. That is, history has a certain, or historical texts have a certain restrictions that they engage in, and literature allows us to rewrite those histories, visit those histories from a different perspective, and see the relationship between history and literature. And so that has become a very important concept for me, that anything I do, I need to know what's happening historically and what is that dialogue that's taking place between literature and history. And so in graduate school, I began to read these writers, but I also ran across works by Richard Jackson, Lemuel Johnson, Miriam DaCosta Willis, people who were writing about the Black experience. And I felt that, there's something missing here, because these were works that had to do with particular groups, but there was really no collection of essays that entertained various different aspects. And so, as a graduate student, I began to work on this anthology that is called Voices from Under, uh, Voices from Under, what's it called? Um, Black narrative in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's been a long time. And it became one of those early anthologies that looked at the Caribbean spaces, looked at Brazil, looked at Latin America, and saw that the unifying element was the Black experience. And so that was an early interest for me, and publication. And also, um, as I mentioned, I was writing on this Cuban writer, and was looking at other issues that had to do with Cuba, but also as a founding member of the association, there was a Caribbean Studies Association that was headed by O.R. Daythorne. And so I became an early member, and so I started traveling throughout the Caribbean and realized, learned quite a bit about the Caribbean, not only just about Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, but we traveled to Martinique, we traveled to Trinidad, we traveled all over the place, and so that was a great experience for me. Early on in my career, also, an unusual thing happened to me, is that uh, you're familiar with the Handbook of Latin American Studies, where scholars, distinguished scholars of the field, read everything in the field that is sent to them by the Library of Congress, and then you write notations and you write introductory essays. Well, early on in my career, to my surprise, I was approached to take over the advisory and contributing section of the Caribbean for the Handbook of Latin American Studies, which meant that it was an enormous amount of work, because everything that was published of or about Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic was sent to me. And then I had to read them and write notations of the works that I thought were of importance to me. And then write, as I said, write an introductory essay showing where movement was going. And so I read a lot, and I thought a lot. I did a lot of thinking about what was happening. And so in that particular, and I did this for the entire decade of the '80s. So if you go to the Handbook of Latin American Studies, you'll see my name and my contributions. And we were there's a funny part to this story, is because we were always asked to go every year to the Library of Congress to check the collection there to make sure it was up to date, so on and so forth. And for that, we were paid, which was, I thought, wonderful. But the payment was $50 a year. So it didn't even cover expenses. So I knew that at that time, that what we do in the profession is for love. It's not necessarily for money. But looking at this literature, of course, there was literature that was written in the home country, but then there was literature that was written in the United States or outside of the home country. And I began to look at these two different kinds of literatures, because the literature written from abroad was also, in some respect, written in Spanish, and then in some respect, written in English. And in these kinds of observations, I made a particular distinction that later on I incorporated into an essay, probably the first essay on Latino literature that was asked of me by the editors of the Cambridge History of Latin American Literature. That was one of the first works, that 3-volume work that had to do with what is the literature of Latin America. And there was also one that had to do with Latino literature. And that's the one that I was asked to write. I don't know why I was asked to write, maybe because I'm from New York, but it's not something that I dedicated any scholarly attention to. But then I began to look at where I was from and what was taking place. And what I was able to extract is that there is a distinction between people who, from the home country, who write about the home country, and then people who live abroad who write about the home country. But if you look at the anthologies, or if you look at the literature, they lump them all together. They're all, Martí is Cuban as if never left Cuba. Cirilo Villaverde is Cuban as if he never left Cuba. And I looked at them and I said, that can't be. So that I have to make that distinction between, if you're writing in Cuba, about Cuba, that's one thing. But if you're writing about Cuba from the United States, that's a different thing. And then that allowed me to look at the space of the United States, of how that was incorporated into the writings of, say, Cecilia Valdez and some of and other writers, Martí and so on and so forth, because they were writing in a different space, and that other space had to be present in their works as well. And so I began to look at that relationship. But then I also saw another one that had to do about the home country, written in English. And then that's when I began to look at those work. I began to look at all those, but that became part of my book, Dance Between Two Cultures, Latino Caribbean Literature Written in the United States. And in the first part, I talk about how that literature that is written in English in the United States begins to form a foundation for this literature that's going to be written in English. And it goes back to the 19th century. And so I began to look at those spaces, and of course, with the literature, Latino literature, there is also an Afro-Latino aspect to it that I began to write about. And then I also developed in many other essays that I've published. And so this is kind of some of the trajectory. And so I've gone ahead and worked on, for example, Las Vanguardias del Caribe, Antología y Biografía Anotada de las Vanguardias del Caribe. So I did an 800-page book on gathering the vanguard movement in the Caribbean, which was set to be really non-existent. People talk about the vanguard movement in Mexico, in Brazil, and in Argentina, but there was nothing about, or very little about, Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. And so I took charge of that and produced this volume. And I did so not because I'm an expert on the vanguard, but because somebody said to me, "Hey, why don't you do something about the vanguard?" And I have a hard time saying no. But every time I say yes, I learn more about what I'm doing. And so I did that particular work. And then I was also asked to write one about customs, cultures and customs of Cuba, which is also turned into another book. Coming to the more recent, my most recent work, and like I said, we can go into details about all the in between lines that are present in what I'm saying. But now, my most recent work, which I'm hoping to finish this year, it's on Juan Francisco Manzano and the origin of Cuban culture. Because I've taken a very daring stance. The Cuban culture has always been defined by the Cuban white intellectuals. Domingo del Monte was was the patriarch in the 19th century that promoted Cuban culture. Jose Maria Heredia is considered to be one of the founding writers, Jacinto Milanes, and so on and so forth. But when I began to read Manzano and began to read his poetry, 1821, his first collection of poems, and then 1830, his second collection of poems, which people have not really read. And so I sat there and read everything that Manzano wrote about. I realized that a lot of the ideas that Manzano wrote about and Del Monte talked about as advice for his writer friends. And Del Monte and Manzano didn't meet until 1830. So we're talking about Manzano's first collection of poems of 1821. There you have already a sense of what the nation is, because Cuba doesn't get its independence from Spain until 1895. 1895. So 1895, 1898. And so, whereas other countries in Latin America were already talking about a national literature, Cuba was still a colony, but yet at the same time, it was talking about a national literature, which is kind of interesting within the space of the colonial power. And so I saw that that there was elements that Del Monte would later talk about, that there was no doubt in my mind that came from Manzano. So Del Monte, my proposition is that Del Monte used many of the ideas that are present in Manzano's poetry in order to guide writers from his literary circle about what should be a Cuban literature. So this is a very daring proposition, that the center of Cuban culture is based on the writings of an enslaved. And well, everything I do is controversial, so it doesn't really the information, the backing, the analysis, it's all there, and so that's an important element. And then the other important element that I've been talking about, and I have given talks here and in Senegal regarding this other aspect of the transatlantic abolitionist movement, is that Manzano is at the center of that movement. Not only in England, in France, but also in the United States, mainly due to Richard Robert Madden's translation of Manzano's work, Formed by Slave in the Island of Cuba, 1840. And so what I've been able to see was to follow what was happening in the periodicals in Great Britain and England about the anti-slavery movement, and how those ideas were also transferred to the periodicals in the United States, the abolitionist periodicals. And Madden's works was connecting from England to, in this particular case, to the United States. And so a lot of the information that came out was being repeated in abolitionist periodicals. Anyway, so to get to the point is that Madden's book, and then of course Madden wanted to protect Manzano's identity, so he just called him Juan. So we never really understood who that Juan was, but anybody who was familiar with Cuba and Cuban literature and history would know there was only one Juan who was writing, which was Manzano. So he really didn't protect his identity. but he did confuse his identity. Anyway, so what I show in this particular um, chapter that's over 100 pages has to do with the influence that Madden and Manzano through Juan had on Frederick Douglass writing his narrative and William Lloyd Wright's participation in that, because there's a relationship that I bring to that. Madden's relationship with Manzano is imitated with William Lloyd Wright's relationship with Frederick Douglass. And so I was able to follow the movement of ideas in periodicals, in abolitionist periodicals, and also began to do a very close reading of Douglas's narrative and Manzano's autobiography. And there are so many resemblances that cannot be just attributed to coincidences. The same dates, a year, they're both at 6 years old. This happens, the beginning of the narrative, the magical moments that happen, the resistance, and so on and so forth. It's all almost mirrored. And so this is the and this has been a labor of love, and I'm glad that I didn't publish the book 10 years ago, which is probably have been ready. But this last 2 or 3 years in discovering the impact of Manzano's voice in the narrative in the abolitionist narrative in the United States, the African American abolitionist narrative comes directly from Manzano. Of course, there were other writers that were writing, Mary Prince, and so on and so forth, which I do deal with, and we talk. And I also am aware of Equianos, and that also fits in. And there are all sorts of explanations, and this is a very complicated history. But the point that I want to make here in this most recent part of my research has to do with the relationship between Manzano and Richard Madden and Lloyd Wright and Frederick Douglass. Also, I'll just end on another note. I've had also the privilege of being asked to write introductory essays for well-known works, and one of them that I want to call to your attention is the 50th anniversary of Biografía de un Cimarrón, translated by Nick Hill. I was asked to write the introductory essay, which allowed me to explore the relationship between biography and autobiography. We normally tend to look at them as two distinct genres, but I see that in this particular work, biography is autobiography, and autobiography is biography. That's one work that I'm really proud of. And then the other one is I was asked to write the introductory essay for the translation of Chango el Gran Putas into English by Jonathan Titler. And there I was able to also read Chango very, very carefully to understand how the inner workings of the novel, which is a fantastic novel. If you haven't read it, it is the novel of the African diaspora. It is the only work of the African diaspora in any language. So I encourage you to read it, but it allowed me to be involved with Manuel's work. And then finally, just to because this is all connected in some respect in a personal but also professional manner, is that I was able in preparing an early issue of Manuel Zapata Olivella for the Afro-Hispanic Review. I had the opportunity of meeting his daughter, Edelma Zapata Perez, and we became really good friends. And it was through our relationship that we were able to get Manuel Zapata Olivella's archive to Vanderbilt University. So we hold at Vanderbilt the archive of Manuel Zapata Olivella, which is a rich archive that has documents, has tapes, has interviews, has videos, has all sorts of things. And we did so with the intention of putting it all on public display for everybody to have access to. But by acquiring Manuel Zapata Olivella's archive, we also acquired the archive of his sister, Delia. And in acquiring the archive of Delia, we also acquired the archive of Juan, who was Manuel Zapata's brother, who was a politician, but also a poet in his own right. And then finally, we also, with the passing of Edelmira, we also acquired her archive as well. So Vanderbilt has become we have a piece of Columbia at Vanderbilt University that we're very proud of, and this archive is the most consulted archive of any of the archives that has Vanderbilt. The Vanderbilt holds, excuse me, this is the most important one, and so we're very proud of it. We also give grants for people to go and study Mana's work or any of the other archives that we have at Vanderbilt. So do consider that as well as a place to do some research and write. So anyway, these are just a couple of things about how the curriculum vitae doesn't really show a lot of the personal aspects and I wanted to bring those two together, and then you can ask questions of other things. Thank you.
Yo tenía preparado una reflexión titulada Migrants, reterritorialización de imaginarios en la literatura africana de expresión en español. Entonces, partiré de citar esos conceptos de lo que Dominic Thomas describe como Transcolonial Theoretical Model, complementado con la noción de migritude de Jacques Chevrier y cerrando con Migrants de Aminata Dramane Traoré. Pero voy a empezar aquí con una cita que va a ayudar a contextualizar lo que yo llamo la experiencia del desplazamiento transfronterizo y sus representaciones en la literatura africana de expresión en español, partiendo de esos teóricos que acabo de mencionar, Dominic Thomas, Jacques Chevrier y finalmente Aminata Traoré. Pero quiero empezar con una cita. El desplazamiento transfronterizo verdaderamente lleva a los protagonistas a buscar lo que Elizabeth García Montes de la Universidad de Calgary llama to find spaces in which to rebuild a new sense of identity. Es lo que lleva uno de los objetivos de ese desplazamiento transfronterizo. Pero para contextualizarlo, hay un libro muy importante que se publicó entre Senegal y Francia, titulado Figures et discours de migrants en Afrique, por Abdurrahman Seck, Mohamed Abdel Si y Cécile Khalid. Dice, inscrite dans les corps, transmise depuis des centaines de générations, la volonté ou le désir de départ en Afrique constitue une réalité si ancienne et si banale qu'elle fait partie d'un mode d'être au monde. Si les chemins, les destinations, les intentions et les effets de cette mobilité changent en fonction des lieux, des moments et des dynamiques sociales, sans cesse en transformation, les traces qu'ils laissent dans les mémoires demeurent et irriguent les expériences nouvelles, les trajectoires et les devenirs. Ces traces passent par les mots et les images, les figures et les discours, circulant de manière fluide dans les conversations de la vie quotidienne, à travers les chansons, les textes littéraires ou encore au sein des institutions. Ces traces sont réappropriées, transformées à chaque fois pour donner un sens au moment présent et donner sens a des directions, des choix et des créations. Entonces aquí lo que hace verdaderamente es resumir lo que es la movilidad transfronteriza. No es un fenómeno reciente, sino que es lo que caracteriza la experiencia del ciudadano africano, incluso mucho antes de la creación de los estados modernos. Y es dentro de ese contexto que la lideresa y política Aminata Dramane Traoré de Mali propone el concepto de migrants. Y dice así, migrants resulta efectivamente de la contracción de la palabra migración y errancia. Benjamin Stora también empleó el término, pero en singular. Errancia en el desierto, ayer en los alrededores de Ceuta y Melilla, donde algunos, como señalas, vivieron durante meses en el bosque atormentado por el miedo a morir de hambre, de sed o de enfermedad. También, como escribiste al evocar nuestros famosos capitanes de barcos, errancia en alta mar. Ahora, eso viene de un libro muy importante, interesante que mostré ayer en una de las diapositivas. Se titula La gloire des imposteurs y ha sido traducido al español. Se puede conseguir en España. ¿Qué pasa ahí? Aquí es una larga conversación epistolar entre Aminata Traoré y Boubacar Boris Diop, otro escritor senegalés que trabajó en el rescate de la memoria de la tragedia de Ruanda. Entonces se escriben. Entonces ahí hay mucha información, mucho material teórico y crítico que podemos utilizar nosotros los investigadores en nuestros trabajos, sobre todo los que trabajan la migración, que es últimamente lo que yo estoy trabajando. Y de hecho, dentro de poco, si no ha salido ya, saldrá un artículo mío en Study Hispanici de alguna revista de Italia que es sobre la migración en la literatura africana de expresión en español. Hay una bibliografía bastante amplia sobre ese tema y que empieza en la literatura francófona a partir de 1937 o incluso antes. Uno de los primeros textos que pude rastrear es Mirage de Paris de Ousmane Socé Diop de Sénégal, Chemin d'Europe de Ferdinand Oyono, Un nègre à Paris, Ferdinand Oyono de Cameroun, Un nègre à Paris de Bernard Dadier de Costa de Marfil, Côte d'Ivoire, Le Petit Prince de Belleville y de Calix Beyala, también de Cameroun, et Les Honneurs Perdus de Calix Beyala, también de Cameroun, Le Cri du Cœur de Idrissa Ouedraogo de Burkina Faso, y otra vez de Sénégal, Le Ventre de l'Atlantique de Fatou Diom, ou Celles qui attendent de Fatou Diom. Y en la literatura africana de expresión en español podemos hablar de Juan Manuel Davis. Casi toda su obra, yo creo que tiene como 8 o 9 libros, todos tratan de una forma u otra del desplazamiento transfronterizo. Y Mamadou Dia de Senegal, que tiene un libro muy interesante titulado 3052, que son el número de kilómetros que separan Senegal de Jersey. Y también tenemos a Kizembo de Angola, que el trabajo, construcción o esclavitud, algo así. Y Mahop Mahop de Camerún, ¿verdad? Y Ibrahima Balde de Gambia, la novela que publicó es Hermanito Miñán. Y Ibrahima Ba de Guinea-Conakry, 3 días en la arena. Bashir Samb de Senegal, una carta para Adelina. Y Nongo Vimakome, nativas. Entonces, todos esos son textos que tratan del desplazamiento transfronterizo y todo lo que supone con esa renegociación de la identidad en la literatura africana de expresión. Pero yo también quiero aquí sugerir el cine, porque el cine es otra forma, otros textos que tratan del desplazamiento transfronterizo transnacional. Se puede citar ya muy temprano el cine, el que se ha identificado como el padre del cine africano, Ousmane Sambel, La Noire 2, de 1960. Entonces, ahí ya trata de ese cine de la inmigración. Y más recientemente, Atlantique, de Mathieu Diop. Atlantique lo pueden encontrar en Netflix. Está en su versión inglesa, Atlantics, en este caso. Y también Yo Capitán, también trata de cine de la migración. Y Las Cartas de Alou, que es de las más antiguas, que también trata de la inmigración. Y más recientemente, The Pirogue, La Piragua, de Moussa Traoré. Y L'Histoire de Suleiman, Maurice Lesquel, del 2024, este es muy reciente. Entonces, aquí hay material para estudios comparativos. No es que los textos se basen en el cine, como en el caso de Ousmane Sambel, pero aquí son textos que nos presentan diversos aspectos del desplazamiento transfronterizo desde África, pero muy específicamente enfocado en la literatura africana de expresión en español, como lo llama. Entonces, la migrance se expresa a través de lo que Jean-Philippe de Dieu llama la parole immigrée. Y esa parole immigrée que es diversa, es dinámica, las que expresa ese fenómeno de la migrance, que sobre todo se centra por el abandono, a veces voluntario o abrupto, pero casi siempre traumático, y la separación de lo que yo llamo el lugar orgánico. El lugar orgánico, por lo menos tal como lo veo, es el lugar de origen. ¿Entiendes? Entonces, esa separación. Entonces, esa migración implica lo que el escritor guineo-ecuatoriano José Siale Giangani llama la dislocación fronteriza, literalmente. Entonces, si bien la frontera se concibe con un lugar donde interactúan de forma fluida o a veces traumática, Ceuta, Melilla, Libia, ¿verdad? Eso supone una dislocación. Y el fenómeno de l'errance, porque el errance es un movimiento perpetuo en un espacio bastante abierto. Las fronteras parecen moverse. Además, moverse hacia el horizonte y moverse hacia nosotros, porque no sé si han oído el fenómeno de la externalización de las fronteras. Y no lo empezaron los europeos, sino a los australianos, porque todos los que querían los detenían en una isla de esos micro reinos que hay en la Polinesia, para que no llegaran al territorio australiano. Entonces, la movilidad o la fluidez de las fronteras puede ser hacia afuera, puede ser hacia mí, con esas nuevas políticas de externalización de las fronteras. Entonces, y es dentro de ese contexto que Jacques Chevrier propone, ese contexto de movilidad transfronteriza, que Jacques Chevrier propone el concepto de migritude, ¿verdad? Migritude, un concepto mucho más como es la heredera de lo que es la literatura de la negritud. Y define la literatura de la migritude como sigue. Dice, otra vez en francés, por favor, me ayudan aquí. Dice, ce néologisme indique clairement que l'Afrique dont nous parlent les écrivains contemporains n'est plus celle qui servait de cadre à la plupart de leurs devanciers. Mais si l'on peut dire ainsi, d'une Afrique extracontinentale dont le centre de gravité se situerait quelque part entre Belleville y au-delà du périphérique. Ahora, se refiere a Francia aquí, pero en este caso, si pues, hablamos de España, podemos hablar de Vallecas, podemos hablar de Vicálvaro, ¿verdad? Y etcétera. Entonces, todo ese periférico. Y el crítico y escritor Abdurrahman Waberi de Djibouti los llama a esos escritores los niños de la postcolonia, les enfants de la postcolonie, ¿verdad? Entonces, il dice así, les enfants de la postcolonie sont, à notre connaissance, les premiers à user sans complexe du double passeport. Es decir, que una vez cuando se nacionalizan, adquieren la nacionalidad, muchas veces es la doble nacionalidad. Dice, jouer sur 2, 3 ou 4 tableaux à se considérer comme africain et vouloir en même temps dépasser cette appartenance. Pour forcer un peu le trait, on pourrait dire qu'auparavant, qu'on se voulait d'abord nègre et qu'aujourd'hui, on se voudrait d'abord écrivain et accessoirement nègre. Entonces lo que dice es lo que, donde nos lleva a ese... entonces, y voy a leer esta última cita y voy a parar ahí. Álvaro Fernando Bruno y Florencia Garamia le puede dar esa referencia completa. Dicen, entonces, ¿cómo interrogar al sujeto nómada e inestable que evoca la inmigración, el exilio y la diáspora? ¿Cómo leer la proliferación de sentido, la movilidad y la incertidumbre de su lugar sin volver a fijar su propio abandono de las raíces, su oposición al Estado, su inmigración de la ciudadanía, su cosmopolitismo, la errancia entre dos o más culturas y la proyección de ficciones de identidad generada por los desplazamientos individuales y colectivos, y nos permite pensar al sujeto migrante en un lugar doble, híbrido y no unitario. Entonces, eso resume hasta cierto punto ese desplazamiento, esa renegociación de identidades. Y en la literatura, entonces muchas veces sume al escritor en lo que Reda Bensmaya llama el nomadismo. ¿entiendes? Entonces yo lo llamo la transhumancia cultural, porque muchos de esos escritores a veces lo que Papa Samba Diop llamaba le voyage entre les langues. Muchos de esos escritores tienen su lengua materna, la lengua heredada y luego la lengua del país de llegada. Entonces ahí se da o ocurre ese nomadismo lingüístico, ese nomadismo, esa transhumancia cultural que muchas veces implica esa negociación y renegociación de identidades. Y en la obra de estos autores, el país de origen está siempre presente. Está siempre, siempre presente. Entonces, voy a dejarlo aquí. Había más, pero en cualquier caso, lo que es importante reflejar aquí es que el cordón umbilical, independientemente del trauma de la separación, nunca ha sido cortado, ¿verdad? Y entonces eso es lo que, y en este caso solo me estoy refiriendo a la literatura africana de expresión en español. Muchas gracias.
Thank you again for this great presentations. And then it's really an honor, a blessing to have all these pioneers of the field here with us. It's not every day. And then my question was about el futuro de nuestro campo. ¿Qué pasa con el futuro de los estudios afrohispánicos? Y también para los estudiantes que están en el campo ahorita, estos estudiosos que mañana va a representar el campo, ¿qué pasa con el mercado? ¿Cuál va a ser el futuro de esos estudiantes? Gracias.
En la medida de lo posible, que puedan volver un poco al tema del contradiscurso en su propia investigación.
Well, what I can tell you from my experience and what I'm hearing in a quote-unquote high-powered meeting, at least what I'm feeling, let me put it that way. Number one is that the humanities as a whole are under siege, right? The narrative that we are hearing are just revolve around STEM, and I have the impression, that there is a commodification of education. There is and here you will forgive me, I'm going to butcher English. There is a Wall Streetization of education. So I think that given that pressure, it is incumbent upon us to find at least alternative ways of repositioning ourselves without losing our soul. That's very, very important. And so to show that what we are doing, has its place in the current environment, in the current economy, and we can contribute to the growth of that economy because it's just not one-way street. And a country, whether it is the US or any other countries, I'm saying, can't be developed or can progress only with the contribution of one side of society. I'm just using society in the broad sense, But let's not make a mistake. We are under siege. And not only that, because there are laws, there are bills that are being pushed in the background just to restrict or limit assistance or support for some discipline at the federal level. And that's really, really very kind of troubling. And so I do believe that we need to have at least form a common front, and we have universities here who are one. They have a stronger voice than those of us who are not there yet. They have more leverage. You have universities that are well positioned to have their voices heard or their position heard, right? So, and I think that we also need to, from our different disciplines, to share that discourse with students, because those students are the ones who are going to be up there decision makers, and they're our best allies. Whether they are engineer, whether they are, but just to make them understand that if you don't know how to read, you cannot solve a problem, a math problem, because you need to understand what is being asked first. And finally, and I think that we have the power to vote, because when I hear politicians, and I'm sorry that I'm going to make this statement here, whenever they are in campaign talking about education, blah, 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 and I usually say, these folks, most of them, the last time they set foot on a campus was that they graduated. They have no clue of what they're talking about, And so we need to make sure that they understand what is at stake.
Thank you for the question. I will answer in an unofficial capacity. I'm not a dean, so I will give you a different interpretation. I think our studies, African studies, African diasporic studies, I think we're in a good place. I think we're in a good place because we're beginning to discover things that have been hidden, had been silenced, and through research and through our own determination and our own understanding, we're beginning to uncover new things. I'm as I've mentioned other times, I believe in the cycles of history. I'm a Baconian in that sense. I follow Giambattista Vico's ideas of cycles that were also in Spengler and another philosopher. But in this particular case, what I attribute or what I contribute to this is the cycle of oppression and rebellion. The more oppression you have, incites more rebellion. And so even though we are in a cycle of repression, I have no doubt that that is going to create a cycle of rebellion and resistance. And I think we're seeing it already. So in that case, I think our future is good. I heard a talk yesterday about the African presence in the flamenco. We know that there's African presence in tango. We know that the first cowboys were blacks. There is a whole history of not only in this country, but in other countries where the black presence has been denied a right to exist and to contribute to society. And through our expertise and in our knowledge, and hopefully with the students' knowledge and other generations that will come, we're going to continue to follow these clues, these pistas, to uncover other things that are still yet to be uncovered. And then it is our responsibility to analyze it and to understand it. And so I think that our future is, in spite of the rebellion, the repression that we're experiencing, I think our future, if we follow our hearts and if we follow our passion, that we will continue to move into this future and discover new things, as some of us have talked about. And I've talked about my relationship with Manzano's relationship with Douglas and other things. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of serious work that needs to be done. So I say prepare yourself as best as you can, and then just move forward in the avenues that you have passion to and that will move you.
I was saying that I agree that the question is a very relevant one, very pertinent one. I would even add that it's an urgent one at a time like this. Willie has just said that we're in a good place, and to be candid, I wish I shared his optimism. Of course, he's been in this for a long, long time. His memory goes back to the early days. We're talking 60 years now of our field, having gained some visibility and having started to create this wonderful archive that gives him his optimism, gives me some optimism too. But the days of Miriam DaCosta Willis, Marvin Lewis, Lawrence Prescott, and these wonderful people, their legacy is this new, if you will, addition to the larger curriculum, right? This thing that Afro-Hispanic studies and so on that has grown over the last decades of the 20th century and became visible and produced an Afro-Romance Institute, for example. But I'm wondering if it did not peak at some point, because this is the only place really that you could associate with a PhD in Afro-Romance studies, right? And as coming in the wake of, the whole civil rights movement in the 60s and all of that stuff. And I'm thinking that there's every reason why it should have grown a little bit more. And the reason why it has not grown a little bit more, I think we all have an idea, right? Because they see you coming up and they decide that, you know what, hasta aquí no más, right? There is that invisible glass ceiling that they put at all times. Okay, so over the past decade or so, we had the DEI movement and so on, and as a result of which, there was the movement was even enhanced and fortified and so on. But look at what we've been having over the past couple of years, right? The institutional support has been withdrawn in many cases. I'm not only talking about us as a relatively minor field, right? I'm speaking more in terms of the humanities and so on. As someone who had a little bit of a stint in the administrative sphere, very humbling, very eye-opening. I don't want to say traumatic, but the word has already come out of my mouth. Vanderbilt lost its PhD program, I understand, right? Imagine that. I mean, the home of the Afro-Hispanic Review, right? My department, I had a stint as chair, and in a situation in which Afro-descendant students were, just the token one. And when Branch got there and started pushing and made that a situation in which they were no longer quote unquote token, a lot of people got nervous. Mm-hmm. Colleagues, all right, who talk out of both sides of their mouths. I'm going to be brutally honest about this, right? They became nervous, and between them and even the student body, it was a very, very disappointing thing for me as a Latin Americanist from the outside. I've spent time in Mexico, in various places in Latin America, and have been accepted as, because that's a function of language, right? You speak somebody else's language, they accept you, that you will learn. I go to Brazil, I go to Cuba, and because of language, people accept me. All right, that barrier is broken. So I was terribly disappointed when my students, the non-Afro-descendant students, started to feel uncomfortable and unwelcome in this new thing that we were trying to create in the department. And the unhappy result of that is that I think the institution saw that we were weak, and as a result of certain other things that were taking place in the department, I summarize it by saying that they shot themselves in the foot. We no longer have a PhD program. So with that, we're talking about R1 institutions. You got Vanderbilt, no PhD program in the field. Pittsburgh, no PhD program in the field. And it's a bad message that goes out, all right, to the rest of the academic community interested in our field. Unfortunately, it's a time when the scope is as more visible than it has ever been, right? Spain, Portugal, the African imprint historically and at the contemporary level, right? This whole thing about migritude, that's a point of departure for some wonderful new studies, right? Because over on this side, we talk about diaspora, and we've been talking about diaspora and studying diaspora for a few decades. But on the other side, in Europe and Africa, and as part of that larger south to north movement, it has global implications and that kind of global possible importance for the academic world that the people in our institutions are not seeing or don't want to see. If a university is about advancing knowledge and people in our field are positioning themselves at the vanguard of that knowledge, there's every reason why they should support us. So I don't know what we need to do to twist their arms to understand. Unfortunately, history moves so slowly that, we probably going to be forced to resign before they understand what's being lost. My sympathy goes out primarily to those young, ambitious, energetic, enthusiastic graduate students who are coming into a field with PhDs and having a difficulty finding a place in the market, right? Because when I came out, I had people who were willing to help me. Lawrence Prescott, William Lewis were willing to, help you directly and or indirectly, right? Because their message out to the rest of the academic world is that this is something that is beginning, it's happening, it's hot, right? Here you have somebody who's young. Nowadays, the new graduates don't have that kind of visibility and don't have that kind of credibility. Okay, so if we're in crisis in the United States, what about the rest of the diaspora, right? Fortunately, Dario brings good news about Colombia, and the institutional support that I suggest is key to this whole thing. All right. A few months ago, we had a very important meeting in Alcalá de Henares, and I realized, you know what? Okay, cycles. Maybe that's another possible future point of departure, because that was one of the most energetic meetings in Alcalá, right, with Wilfried that I've been to in over a decade. All right. So maybe the strategy is for us to, Wilfried Miampika used the word federación. All right. And maybe that's where we should probably be thinking. Us putting our heads together and working together across the Atlantic, right? And connecting those dots so that we could find ways. Mayra Santos Febres could not make it, but she would be a pivotal figure in this. Finding ways to work both within and outside of the institutions to keep this going. Otherwise, 60 years of really hard work, really fruitful work, that's what is we risk losing, and we really can't afford that. We cannot afford that.
Ever since undergraduate school, I have had doors closed on me and others, and also in the field. I can write a book about all the struggles that I've had to face. But the thing is that if the door is closed, you open it. If you fall, you pick yourself up and you continue to struggle and continue to fight. And I, at least, come from my Cuban side. Many of you know that I'm part Chinese and part Cuban. From my Cuban side, my grandfather fought in the, he was a Mambi, and he fought in the war against colonialism. And so there is that part of us also, the cimarronaje, the rebellious slave, that we're not willing to be shackled, or we're going to fight to not to be shackled. We have to move forward, and we're always going to have those obstacles. When I was very young, I always thought I can struggle now and fight, and then later when I get older, I can rest. There is no rest. There is no rest. The struggle continues, and we have to keep moving forward. Wherever door opens, that's the one we push forward. And I think that, yes, there is some pessimism or some realism that we need to deal with, and I'm dealing with some of that now, but I'm not going to give up. I'm going to continue to fight. And we have a situation in my department where we just united with French and Italian, and the new chair of the department, we did not vote, but the dean imposed the chair on us. And now we have to fight that. And that's what we have to do, because the moment that we stop fighting, they win. And and as many of our ancestors, we might as well just fight and try to make a good future for our students and for other generations. Unfortunately, there has to be that kind of relationship. Thank you.
Cuando conocí a Jerome hace unos 15 años, aprendí un concepto muy importante que es el del malungaje. Pienso que lo que más va a ayudar a fortalecer este campo en los estudios afrohispánicos y en general afros en el mundo es lo que ya hacemos, que es el malungaje académico. Lo que más nos va a ayudar es que podamos trabajar en redes. Por ejemplo, para el caso colombiano, los aportes de los afroamericanos fueron definitivos para reconocer a Zapata y todo lo que él representaba. Yo creo que estas redes hoy tenemos que fortalecerlas académicamente. Mi doctorado, que es reciente, pequeño, se ha beneficiado mucho de académicos de los Estados Unidos, de África y de Brasil utilizando las tecnologías de la información. De esa medida creo yo que el campo va creciendo. Te contesto por mi universidad. Hace 15 años esos espacios no existían. Ahora ya existen, ya hay un doctorado, ya hay en los pregrados materias exclusivamente dedicadas a esto. De tal manera que poco a poco van llegando profesores, lo mismo en la secundaria. Y otra cosa que hay que prestarle mucha atención, y con esto finalizo, es que en los cambios que han habido en el mundo actual, vamos a necesitar mucha gente utilizando las tecnologías de la información, en guiones, en cine, en nuevas formas de periodismo, en las nuevas formas de comunicación. O sea, campos creo yo que va a haber muchísimo de aquí en adelante. Ahora, la fortuna es que esto cada vez crece más, es muy vigoroso y lo que aprendimos en el caso mío con Manuel para Colombia fue extraordinario. Yo creo que la semilla que él sembró hace 50 años, mira todo lo que ha dado en el caso colombiano, lo que nos ha relacionado como nunca con África, con los Estados Unidos hemos retomado relaciones con el Caribe. O sea, el campo está creciendo y eso es lo que me parece que es bastante venturoso y que nos hace ver que el futuro es luminoso.